discuss the external features of the cerebellum. Today I'm going to discuss again both the external features as well as the internal features of the cerebellum. I'm sure you can remember that cerebellum has three major functions. The first one is maintenance of equilibrium. The second one is proprioception. And the third one is coordination of voluntary motor movement. Anatomically, you are all aware that cerebellum has three lobes: anterior lobe, posterior lobe, and flocculonodular lobe. But functionally speaking, the cerebellum is also divided into three functional parts. If you can remember what I was discussing about the cerebellum in the previous video, I said that the two cerebellar hemispheres, the left and the right cerebellar hemispheres, are all connected in the midline by a midline structure known as the vermis. So the vermis connects the two cerebellar hemispheres, that is both the left and the right cerebellar hemispheres. They have been joined together by the central structure known as the vermis. And there is also another lobe that is just at the inferior aspect of the posterior lobe of the cerebellum, and that is what is known as the flocculonodular lobe. So as I said earlier, that the cerebellum is functionally divided into three parts, what we call spinocerebellum. That means part of the cerebellum receiving information from the spinal cord. That means all the proprioceptive information from our joints, from our muscles, they have been taken from different parts of the body, and that information passes through the spinal cord into the cerebellum. So the area receiving this information from the spinal cord, that is what is known as the spinocerebellum. And this area that is receiving this proprioceptive information include the vermis that connect the two cerebellar hemispheres, as well as the paravermal area, that is some portion of both the left and the right cerebellar hemispheres. So that is the spinocerebellum, that is the vermis, plus the paravermal area, some portion of the left and the right cerebellar hemispheres. The second one is what we call the cerebrocerebellum. The cerebrocerebellum are nothing but the two remaining portions of the two cerebellar hemispheres, that is the left and the right cerebellar hemispheres, if you remove the paravermal portion from either of the two cerebellar hemispheres. And the reason why this cerebrocerebellar is named like that is because these two cerebellar hemispheres, they receive information from the cerebral cortex. For example, if somebody wants to plan and initiate a motor movement, information for planning and execution of that motor movement comes from the cerebral hemispheres, and so that information passes from the cerebral hemisphere, passes through the midbrain, through the pons, and from the pons now it goes into the cerebellum. And this portion of information coming from the cerebral hemispheres down to the cerebellum is what is known as the cerebrocerebellum. And so this is responsible for the maintenance of for coordinating voluntary motor movement. So that means this cerebrocerebellum is responsible for the coordination of voluntary motor movement, while the third one, that is responsible for the maintenance of equilibrium with regard to the stability and balance, that is the function of the flocculonodular lobe, and that is what is known as vestibular cerebellum. If you now draw a human being like this, with the head and the trunk, head and neck and the trunk in the midline, and the limbs, going out of the trunk, both the upper and the lower limb, you are going to see that the head, the neck, and the trunk, they are all represented in the mid portion of the cerebellum. That means this head, neck, and the trunk are represented in the vermis. So all the proprioceptive informations coming from the spinal cord into the cerebellum, they pass into the about the head, neck, and the trunk, they pass into the vermis. While proprioceptive information with regard to the upper and the lower limbs, they pass to the paravermal area. That is those portion I was talking about, some portion of the two cerebellar hemispheres on this side from the left side, on this side from the right side. So the paravermal area, or known as the intermediate area, are responsible for receiving information for proprioception from the upper and the lower limb, while the vermal area receive proprioceptive information with regard to the head, neck, and the trunk. So that is for the functional representation of the human body within the cerebellum. So the next one is the cerebellar nuclei. For those of us that are in Nigeria, there is a state known as Kano State. So in Kano State, there are multiple entrances. One of the entrances to the city of Kano State is known as Kofar Mazugal. So Mazugal is an entrance in Kano State of Nigeria. And also, as soon as you pass through the Mazugal entrance of Kano State, you reach one place known as Lion Wapa. That Lion Wapa is an area for Birudi change in Kano State. So if you want to understand the acronym for the cerebellar nuclei, I made it to be FAGE-D. FAGE-D is a name of quarters in Kano State. As soon as you pass through the entrance of this Kofar Mazugal to Lion Wapa, you are going to pass through this FAGE-D. So from medial, that is Mazugal M. From medial to lateral, that is Lion Wapa. So you are going to see this FAGE-D. So this FAGE-D is an acronym for the cerebellar nuclei, while from Mazugal to Lion Wapa is a mnemonic. So this mnemonic from Mazugal to Lion Wapa, M from medial, L to lateral, FAGE-D, you are going to, see this is the acronym for the cerebellar nuclei. So we have 4 cerebellar nuclei. The first one from the medial side, if you now divide the cerebellum into 2 equal halves, left side or left half and the right half, so on either of the 2 halves, you have 4 nuclei. So from medial to lateral, the most medial among these 4 nuclei is what is known as fastigial nucleus, which is Fe. The second one is globus nucleus, which is following the fastigial nucleus. And then the third one is what is known as involuform nucleus. So this involuform nucleus is the third from medial to lateral, and the last one, or the most lateral one, is what was known as dentate nucleus. So dentate, among all these 4 nuclei, or in each of these cerebellar hemisphere, the dentate nucleus is the largest and is the most lateral among the 4. While the second one, the involuform, is the second largest, then followed by the remaining 2 nuclei. The two most medial nuclei, that is the fastigial nucleus and the globus nucleus, they are the smallest among the 4 nuclei. But what you people should understand is that the globus nucleus and the involuform nucleus, the 2 together, they are called interposed nuclei, which we will discuss later on. So now we've seen that from Mazugal to Lion Wapa, we have FAGE-D. So now we have fastigial nucleus, we have globus nucleus, we have involuform nucleus, we have the dentate nucleus. So these are the 4 cerebellar nuclei responsible for giving out information from the cerebellum to the cerebral cortex or to the spinal cord. So we have cerebellocortical fibers getting out of this nuclei, or cerebellosspinal tracts, that are going from the cerebellum down to the spinal cord. So that is for the cerebellar nuclei. So the next thing to discuss is the cerebellar peduncles. In the previous videos, you can remember that I discussed about the external features of the cerebellum, where I also briefly discussed about the three connections of the cerebellum with the brainstem. So the brainstem is directly connected to the cerebellum by these three cerebellar peduncles. We have one, the superior cerebellar peduncle, connecting the midbrain to the cerebellum, and then we have the middle cerebellar peduncle connecting the pons with the cerebellum, and then finally we have inferior cerebellar peduncle connecting the medulla oblongata and upper part of the spinal cord with the cerebellum. So these are the three connections between the back of the brainstem and the anterior portion or ventral portion of the cerebellum. So in each of these cerebellar peduncles, we are going to see fibers going in or coming out of each of these, cerebellar peduncles. So for example, now, if I now start with the inferior cerebellar peduncle, the main fibers, that are forming these inferior cerebellar peduncles are the afferent fibers. That means fibers carrying information from different parts of the body to the cerebellum through these inferior cerebellar peduncles. If you can remember, I said that part of the function of the cerebellum is proprioceptive, receiving proprioceptive information from different parts of the body. So now, if you divide the human body into two halves, left half and the right half, so each of these half, all those proprioceptive information from the muscles and joints, have been taken to that side of the same side of the cerebellar hemisphere, and so also the same on the other side. So from the face, or from the head and the face, the proprioceptive information from the muscles of the face, and the joints of the face, this information of the proprioception is being taken through the trigeminal nerve. And so if you can remember, trigeminal nerve emanates from the pons. So the proprioceptive information from the face passes through the trigeminal nerve to the cerebellum. So the trigeminal nerve has three nuclei, one in the midbrain known as mesencephalic nucleus, the other one is lying in the pons known as the principal sensory nucleus, and the other one is the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. So this information from the face, as it passes into the trigeminal nerve, so from the trigeminal nerve, the second order neurons, they now begin from the mesencephalic nucleus, from the principal pontine nucleus, and from the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. The information now passes into the cerebellum, and that is what is known as trigeminal-cerebellar tract or fibers or pathway. So we have proprioceptive information from the face through the trigeminal nerve to the cerebellum, and that is the trigeminal-cerebellar fibers, receiving proprioceptive information from the face, taking it to the cerebellum. The second one is the kineo-cerebellar fibers. The kineo-cerebellar fibers, they carry proprioceptive information from the neck and the upper limb. So the neck and the upper limb, that is from C1 down to C8, all this proprioceptive information, from the neck and the upper limb, the information is being taken, and the first order neuron, passes through the posterior root of each of the spinal nerve, and from there now the fibers, they don't pass through the posterior horn of the spinal cord, but rather they ascend in the posterior column of the spinal cord, and then until the fibers reach the medulla oblongata, where there is an accessory cunate nucleus at the level of the medulla oblongata. From there, the second order neuron from these fibers ascend up and then go into the cerebellum, into the cerebellar cortex. So we have cuneo-cerebellar fibers getting information of proprioception from the neck and the upper limb, that is between C1 and C8, and then passes through the dorsal column or posterior column of the spinal cord, and then ascend up until the first order neuron reaches, or they reach the accessory cuneate nucleus at the level of the medulla oblongata. From there, the second order neuron ascend up and then goes into the cerebellar cortex through the inferior cerebellar peduncle. The third one is the dorsal spinocerebellar tract. The spinocerebellar tract, is divided into dorsal and ventral spinocerebellar tract. So the dorsal spinocerebellar tract passes through the inferior cerebellar peduncle, while the ventral spinocerebellar tract passes through the superior cerebellar peduncle. So for this dorsal spinocerebellar tract, all this proprioceptive information from the neck, that means below the neck, down to the level of L1, all these truncal muscles and the joints, the proprioceptive informations, are being carried through this dorsal spinocerebellar tract, and the first order neurons, as they pass through the posterior root of the spinal nerve, the fibers, they pass through the posterior horn of the spinal cord, and then from the posterior horn they reach the Clark's nuclei, and from the Clark's nuclei, second order neuron now gets out. They get out of the gray matter of the spinal cord and then form the dorsal spinocerebellar tract on the inside the lateral pedunculus, and then these fibers, the second order neuron, they ascend up through the spinal cord, through the medulla oblongata, until they now reach the cerebellum through the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So proprioceptive information from the level of T1 down to the level of L1, that means proprioception from the truncal, muscles and joints. Information of proprioception is being taken from there through the posterior root of the spinal nerve, through the posterior horn of the spinal cord, and from there, second order neuron from the Clark's nucleus, they get out of the gray matter, they form the lateral or the dorsal spinocerebellar tract, and then from there ascend up through the medulla, from the through the spinal cord, through the medulla oblongata, and then through the inferior cerebellar peduncle down into the cerebellum. Other ones include the external arcuate fibers. The external arcuate fibers, if you can remember, I discussed about the proprioceptive fibers, carrying informations, from, different part of the body through the gracile and, cuneate fasciculi. So through the gracile and cuneate fasciculi, the conscious proprioceptive information from different parts of the body, they ascend up through the cuneate and the gracile fasciculi. They ascend up at the first order neuron. As soon as these fibers reach the medulla oblongata, the second order neuron at the cuneate and the gracile nuclei at the level of the medulla oblongata, the second order neuron now ascend up, as what is known as, after crossing to the either side, the fibers ascend up as what we call dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway, and then they finally enter into the thalamus as the dorsal column medial lemniscus, responsible for carrying conscious proprioceptive information from the different part of the body. So it suffices to say that this conscious proprioceptive fibers, as they form this dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway, they go into the cerebral hemisphere through the thalamus. So some portion of these fibers, as as they get out of the cuneate and the gracile nuclei before the medial lemniscus is informed, some of the fibers, they act around the medulla oblongata and as the external arcuate fibers until they now reach the inferior cerebellar peduncle, and then they now finally go into the cerebellar cortex. And so they now carry information with regard to the conscious proprioception, while the trigeminal cerebellar Kineo cerebellar and the dorsal spinocerebellar fibers. They carry unconscious proprioceptive information from these parts I have made mention before. The oligocerebellar fibers, they carry information, from the fibers begin from the olive down to the cerebellar cortex through the inferior cerebellar peduncle, and these are responsible for the fine-tuning or regulation of our body voluntary motor movement. The other one, that is also forming, the inferior cerebellar peduncle is what is known as vestibular fibers. If you can remember, the ear is divided into external ear, which is the pinna, the middle ear, and then the internal ear. So in the internal ear, there are what are known as the semicircular canals, and these semicircular canals, within them, information with regard to the balance and stability, fibers from the vestibular portion or the vestibulocochlear nerve, they begin from the semicircular canals of the internal ear as well as the vestibule of the internal ear. These fibers, as they pass out of the internal ear, they pass through the vestibular nuclei that are found in the pontomedullary junction, and from there, second order neuron, they now pass to the cerebellar cortex, to the cerebellum through the inferior cerebellar peduncle, until they finally now reach the flocculonodular lobe. If you can remember, I said that the flocculonodular lobe is responsible for the maintenance of equilibrium. So from the internal ear, these fibers, the vestibular component of the vestibulocochlear nerve, they carry this information of equilibrium or balancing, and so the first order neuron, they pass into the vestibular nuclear complex found around the pontomedullary junction. From there, second order neuron now the second order neurons pass through the inferior cerebellar peduncle into the flocculonodular lobe to maintain, equilibrium to our own body. So, but this is, these are the types of fibers that combine together to form the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So, if somebody wants to plan a motor movement, the planning of the motor movement comes from the premotor area. So from the premotor area, these fibers now descend, fibers for planning of motor movement, they descend down through the midbrain to the pons, and so in the pons there are pontine nuclei. These pontine nuclei, as these fibers descend from the cerebral cortex, the pontine nucleus, as this one synapses with the pontine nuclei, so the fibers crisscross each other. As they crisscross each other, those from the right side, they go to the left side. Those from the left side, they go to the right side. So that means they go to form the middle cerebellar peduncle of the opposite side. So that means fibers coming from the cerebral cortex, as they descend into the pons, after synapsing with the pontine nuclei of the right side, those fibers, they crisscross to the left side to connect the left side of the pons with the left cerebellar hemisphere, while the opposite happens. So now it's supposed to say that the corticopontocerebellar fibers form the middle cerebellar peduncle. So it means that the corticopontine fibers, are the source of the pontocerebellar fibers, forming the middle cerebellar peduncle that carry information for motor plan. So, because at any given time, if somebody wants to make a movement, the planning of the motor movement comes through the cerebral cortex to the pons, and from the pons, the information now passes to the cerebellum, so that the cerebellum will now see, what is the actual or the precise motor movement that is, going to be executed without having any problem. So that is the middle cerebellar peduncle. For the superior cerebellar peduncle, the after information for motor planning comes from the cerebral cortex to the cerebellum through the middle cerebellar peduncle. now informations that are reaching the cerebellum through the inferior cerebellar peduncle from various parts of the body with regard to the proprioception. That means with regard to the positions of the muscles in space, positions of our joints in space, and also the muscle spindle, the Golgi organ tendon, as well as the muscle tones. All these informations, are being taken to the cerebellum, so that the cerebellum will now precisely tell the cerebral cortex the actual motor movement that is going to be done, so that this information, after the cerebellum has already calculated the exact motor movement that is supposed to be done, so the information now passes out of the cerebellum as a feedback mechanism from the cerebellum down to the cerebral cortex. And that is the essence of the superior cerebellar peduncle. So we have what we call cerebellothalamic fibers. So these cerebellothalamic fibers begin from the dentate nucleus, pass through the superior cerebellar peduncle, and then they pass through the thalamus. So they can be called cerebellothalamic, and from the thalamus they now ascend up into the cerebral cortex. So similarly, we have the cerebellorubral fibers. These cerebellorubral fibers, they begin from the globus and the envelopum nuclei. So from the envelopum nuclei and the globus nucleus, so these fibers, they get out of the cerebellum through the superior cerebellar peduncle, and then they come out, and then they sign up within the red nucleus as what is known as cerebellorubral fibers. So from this red nucleus, those fibers, they now descend down into the spinal cord as cerebrospinal tract, and this cerebrospinal tract is responsible for fine-tuning of our motor movement. So the next one is the cerebelloreticular fibers. These cerebelloreticular fibers begin from the fastigial nucleus, and then the fibers now get out of the cerebellum through the superior cerebellar peduncle to the reticular formation. If you can remember, reticular formation is a bundle or column of the nucleus that is lying all through the brainstem. That means it cuts across the brain, the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. So these fibers from the fastigial nucleus of the cerebellum, they pass out of the superior cerebellar peduncle to the reticular formation, and from the reticular formation, fibers, they descend down into the spinal cord as what is known as reticulospinal tract. These reticulospinal tracts are also responsible for the regulation or fine-tuning of our motor movement. So these are the efferent fibers getting out of the cerebellum through these nuclei that I've already discussed before. The other fibers going into the cerebellum through the superior cerebellar peduncle is the anterior spinocerebellar fibers, and these are the afferent fibers because they are going into the cerebellum, while the remaining three, they are going out of the cerebellum, and that is why they are called efferent fibers. So there are three. The other one is anterior spinocerebellar going into, and so the anterior spinocerebellar fibers, they carry unconscious proprioception from the level of L2 down, downwards. So all this unconscious proprioception from L2 downward, from the lower limb, entirely. So all this informations are being carried through the anterior spinocerebellar tract. So these fibers, they pass through the posterior root of each of the spinal nerve, and then from there now the first order neuron, now the first order neuron, the neurons pass through the posterior horn of the spinal cord, and from there in the posterior horn of the spinal cord, the first order neuron synapses with the second order neuron in the lamina 7 of the posterior root of the posterior horn of the spinal nerve. So second order neuron, gets out of the gray matter of the spinal cord and forms bundles of, axons in the anterior folliculus of the white matter of the spinal cord, and then ascend up as the ventral or anterior spinocerebellar tract. So that means this spinocerebellar tract, it crosses to the opposite side. So from the left side, it crosses to the right side and ascend up to the right side of the cerebellum. So from the right side of the cerebellum, it crosses back to the left side, so that there is double crossing. It crosses first, in the spinal cord, and the second one is at the level of the superior cerebellar peduncle, where it crosses to the same side where it originated. And so that means the left controls the left. So that is with regard to the anterior spinocerebellar fiber. So it's supposed to say that cerebellum is responsible for receiving both, conscious and unconscious proprioceptive information, and also responsible for coordination of our voluntary motor movement, and finally is responsible for the maintenance of our equilibrium. So by and large, viewers, thank you very much for having time to watch my video. I hope you have enjoyed it, and if you enjoy it, please like the video and also subscribe to it.